Welcome to The Homeless Conservative, a show about principled politics for exhausted citizens. I'm your host, Blake Fisher, and I'm a political junkie so that you don't necessarily have to be. Thanks for spending some of your valuable time with me today. Today we're going to talk about a couple of things, the first of which is Trump's takeover of D.C. to try to get the crime under control there. The reaction from the Democrats, of course, is that there is no crime here. What are you talking about? It's at a 30-year low. You'll not be surprised to find out that both sides are kind of not telling the entire truth, and it's much more complicated and nuanced, and everyone is sort of right and everyone's sort of wrong. And I think it's worth talking about, though, because is this Trump trying to be authoritarian? Is this Trump's sort of second time dipping his toe into sending the National Guard into an area for an emergency that's not really an emergency? Or is there really a problem that can be cleaned up by the federal government taking over D.C.? So let's talk about that. And then we'll also talk about the sort of crony capitalism going on with the Trump administration in the state intermingling with U.S. Steel and the new sort of deal with NVIDIA selling chips to China and the government taking 15% of those profits. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? We'll talk about it. Okay, so Trump's takeover of D.C. Let's talk about the facts here. The whole thing hinges on the question, or at least both sides are saying it hinges on this. Is crime out of control in our nation's capital? That's kind of the first thing that I think is worth answering here, right? Democrats are saying crime's low. It's at a 30-year low. And why do we need to send federal troops into D.C. to solve this problem? It's not a real emergency. Yeah, they're sort of right there in the sense that, yeah, crime is down technically. We've had several peaks in D.C. Specifically there when we're talking about violent crime, because I think crime is a weird thing that you can kind of make statistics do whatever you want. I mean, every statistic you see, you have to take with some sort of grain of salt and ask, like, what's the source of this and what are they really talking about? Because oddly enough, in the run-up and trying to do some research for this episode, I found what I would consider credible resources that had totally different numbers for, like, the violent crime rate in the same year. And the weird thing about it is that I would find they generally had the same homicide. So looking at, I think it was 2024 or 2023, I think it was 2024 that I was looking at. And 187 murders happened, or homicides, and everyone had that number right. But then they would put, like, the violent crime rate or the murder rate per 100,000 people at wildly different numbers. One had it at like 27, one had it at like 18. And what you do is you're dividing the number of homicides by how many hundreds of thousands of people you have so that you can have a number there. So I was like, okay, well, that maybe obviously there's going to be differences in population, because the last time we have an official census is 2020, but DC is going to bring out numbers that say, well, it's actually increased in population, which it has since 2020. But to get down to like 18, you have to overestimate the population by like double. You know, it's like, are there 700,000 people here, or are there 1.4 million? So statistics are weird, especially when you're trying to put it on a chart, because we should measure stuff, just so you know, if you want to get into the nerdy data. If you're measuring crime rates, for example, it is important to do it per population. Otherwise, as the country and as cities get more populated, if you just looked at the raw numbers, if you just looked at that 187 homicides and didn't compare it to how many people live in the area, inevitably that line is going to go up and up and up. This is my problem with box office numbers. It's the dumbest thing ever is that all the time we've got these movies coming out that are breaking box office records. It's a Friday box office record, or the biggest weekend opening ever. Well, yeah, the cost of a movie ticket cost 3 times as much as it did when I was a kid 20 years ago. So of course, if you're just measuring the number and not the number of tickets or per population or anything like that, and obviously when it comes to movies, they're just trying to market things. So who cares if they have an accurate thing? We're not talking about the stat line in a world record or something in an Olympic kind of event. That's movie marketing. That's what they're going to do. But we do that with the data that we hear in crime statistics all the time by politicians and by news organizations and people that have a certain spin they want to put on that data. And I'm trying really not to do that here. I'm trying to kind of just call balls and strikes. But it is very hard because the data is corrupted sometimes. For example, the head of the DC police sort of in statistics stuff, they were fudging some of these numbers, allegedly. Now, we don't have this full story. This is a pretty recent thing. So you can't trust all the numbers. Here's what you can trust. Homicides get reported. Car thefts get reported. Carjackings get reported. There are certain kind of crimes that always get reported, and there's going to be a police report because, for example, if your car gets stolen and you need to file an insurance claim, there has to be a police report for that whole process to happen. Same thing, generally it's very hard for municipalities to cover the bodies that are dead on the street and pretend that they are not homicide victims, right? So those numbers, specifically in DC, are what I've been looking at because I think that those are the easiest ways to tell. Because the violent crime rate, what you'll hear from Democrats is that the violent crime in DC is down. And they are not wrong about it when you take, okay, what are violent crimes, what are not violent crimes, and you divide that by the number and you say, okay, well, yeah, we look at a chart, it's down. Now, when they say it's the lowest it's been in 30 years, they're being a little bit, I think, deceitful there because it's not been, what that makes you think of, in my opinion, is you think of this chart that's going at a downward trajectory for the last 30 years. Like it's been improving over 30 years. And that's not really true. Really, we had a peak in the 90s, which the whole country peaked in the 90s. This is nothing that impressive if you've been down since the 90s, because so is every other part of the country, including the country as a whole and almost every municipality. We had a very bad violent crime problem in the early 90s. And we got that under control to some degree. Basically the violent crime rate in DC did kind of go from peak in the 90s to we have it be quite a bit lower, and it gets to its lowest in 2012. So here's a chart in case you are watching and not listening. But basically, peaks in the early 90s, it falls pretty much, normal all the way to 2012, and then it starts rising again after 2012. It peaks again in 2023. And so, yes, it is down from that peak in 2023, but remember, we're not that far removed from 2023. We only have crime stats for really 2024 in full, and then in 2025, obviously through August now, we are going to have things like how many homicides have happened, how many carjackings, some of those basic numbers. And yes, it has fallen since the height because it peaked back up after COVID. It went way up in DC, and then we've lost the murder rate, for example, from 2023 to 2024 did drop 30%, and that's impressive. And obviously that should go to like credit to some of the police and prosecution and all the people that are involved in that, because that big of a drop. We did see that in some other municipalities, but not necessarily that big. And because there was a peak in crime kind of across the board in America post-COVID. And that had to do with a lot of things. It was the defund the police crap, for sure. It was also that in the peak of COVID, we had to like grind everything to a halt, including the court systems. And so there was a lot of backlog of criminal cases, and prosecution in a lot of situations said, okay, let's plea out the ones that we're not as worried about. I think that they did that maybe too much in some situations. But the point being, yes, Democrats are not wrong when they say that crime is lower than it was in DC. However, there is a problem in the sense that it's not that low, because this is DC's murder rate compared to other major metropolitan areas, and it is fourth in the country behind Detroit, New Orleans, and St. Louis. And that is not great. And by the way, DC has a higher population than some of those, so the rate is certainly lower. But this is a good example of Detroit only lowered their murder rate from 2023 to 2024 by 18%, whereas DC did lower it by 30%. But New Orleans also lowered their by 30%, and St. Louis has actually went up. So this is not just a national trend. This is actually, DC did some things that were obviously better than Detroit and St. Louis did, for example. However, having the fourth highest murder rate in the country, that's not a great look for the nation's capital. So Donald Trump has a point that like it shouldn't be in the top 5. It should not be a place where people are scared to go. And the other thing about violent crime going down, potentially, and some of the ways the numbers get fudged, is that businesses are having trouble staying in business because people are not going out as much. They're not going to public places they used to. These kind of things can make a real difference in the economy and all sorts of things. And so Democrats are playing down the fact that DC has the 4th highest murder rate in the country. And that is wrong of them. And Donald Trump is not wrong to point out that this is a problem. However, I don't think Donald Trump can claim it's an emergency. The murder rate was higher and the violent crime rate was higher in his first term. So he's using emergency powers because the really short version of the complicated scenario that is Washington, D.C. is that about 50 years ago, before that, the federal government had complete control over the district because it's a federal district. And really local people didn't have any say in the election really of the people and the laws that govern them in that area. So 50 years ago, they kind of came up with a plan that said, okay, we're going to give more local control to the voters inside of the district, that is. I can't talk today. And then we will let them, elect their mayor and their city council and stuff like that. And Congress still has sort of a veto on that stuff because Congress is actually the people that pass the budget, for example, for DC and stuff. So basically what it turned into is like, we're going to let the city do its thing. But if they pass a new law, Congress has 30 days to fight it, essentially. And if they don't, it becomes law. There are certain laws that it takes 60 days. The president has some control over the budgetary stuff as well. There's also a very strange thing where they do elect a local DA, but that local DA can only prosecute like low-level crimes. Anything that they consider a felony or violent crimes or things like that are actually prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office. The U.S. Attorney's Office is appointed by the President of the United States. So you can have these wild swings of what gets prosecuted depending on who's in the White House. And as you can probably guess, the last administration did not think that they should be prosecuting as many crimes, and so they didn't. So it wasn't necessarily that the police weren't doing their job. The police were actually arresting people. It's just that the prosecutions went down, and you can see that in this graph where we see prosecutions from 2014 to 2023, and they're pretty high in the 2017s, and then they drop a little bit in 2019, and then 2020, obviously COVID misnomer. We can't like look at COVID. It's an outlier, obviously, but we've still not gotten, even back into 2023, we've still not gotten to pre-2020 prosecution levels. And that's not because crime's gone down. Remember, because 2023, we had the height of the murder rate in DC. So we should have seen more prosecutions of violent crime in 2023 than we saw in 2019, for example, but we did not. So that is Joe Biden and his administration deciding that, I mean, at least to some degree, deciding that over prosecution is a problem. And they stopped prosecuting as many crimes. And so naturally the police maybe stop doing their jobs as well because they're going to go, well, what's the point in arresting this guy if he's just going to be back on the street tomorrow? And that's sort of what happened a lot. So the point being, DC's a weird place, but in the plan of that thing, there were basically all these emergency situations where the federal government could step back in and take back control of the district. And that is what Trump is doing. He's claiming there's an emergency here, and therefore I'm going to send the National Guard in and the FBI, and I'm going to take over the police department, and the federal government's going to run this place for a little bit. He's got a 30-day window of time that he can do that for, and then Congress would have to give him more time if he wants more than 30 days. So here's what I really think is happening here. Donald Trump wants the win. He wants the headline. And I don't think he's really going to try to go beyond 30 days because he doesn't have the attention span to. But I understand people's discomfort with sending the National Guard in to the nation's capital. And it does seem like an authoritarian move. And I don't buy that it's an emergency. So I don't love Trump's some of the motives are good in the sense that, yes, someone needs to do something about crime. At the same time, I don't like that he's sent the National Guard into 2 places already that didn't ask for it specifically. But Democrats are in a little bit of a tough situation here because New York Governor Kathy Hochul did send the National Guard into the subway a few years ago because of the crime problem in the subway in New York City. Now, the thing is, she's totally within her power to do that because that is what the National Guard traditionally does, is the governor of the state calls up the National Guard and has very, in this case, was a very narrowly focused thing and it worked. Like we got a lot less crime, people felt safer, and that's been basically a staple of the New York City subway system for a couple years now. And so when Democrats are like, oh, this is an authoritarian move, this is ridiculous, there's no need for this, Republicans and Donald Trump can go back and say, well, you're a Democratic governor of a very prominent blue state, did the same thing to try to combat crime. Why is it a problem when Trump does it, but not a problem when Kathy Hochul does it? And I think it's a fair point. And so Democrats are really... It truly, their reaction to this whole thing shows how bad they are at politics and how they have not figured out who they are as a party. They got hammered in the 2024 elections, and they have not found a way to talk to those voters who rejected them in 2024 yet. There's a great analysis of Democrats' problem in this Substack called Pitching and Snitching. Here it is. Basically, here's the playbook for Democrats, and this is someone else's writing, just to be totally clear. See if it sounds familiar. Step 1, allow an obvious problem like gang violence, carjacking, shoplifting, organized retail theft, drugs, homelessness, or illegal immigration to metastasize unchecked. Step 2, ignore it long enough for Republicans to discover and own it. Step 3, rather than join them in their anger and concern, righteously tell voters the problem doesn't exist. Step 4, insist voters are racist, sexist, xenophobic, or stupid if they believe the problem does exist. Step 5, indignantly and condescendingly point to charts and stats proving, if only nominally, the problem isn't technically as bad as Trump says it is, because charts and stats are how people decide what to feel. Step 6, wait for Trump to speak insensitively and offensively about the problem and hope that makes the problem go away. Step 7, defend the criminals instead of the victims. Step 8, while doing nothing to solve the problem, wait for a shining example of the problem to emerge and give Republicans a chance to nationalize it. And then he says, like this one, or this one, he's talking about Laken Riley's murder, or the attacking of the ex-Doge staffer that triggered this entire thing in D.C., or what was the third example? I forget the third example. But step 9, oppose obvious solutions because they are suggested by Republicans. Step 10, cede both the problem and the solution to Trump. That does feel exactly like the Democratic playbook since 2015, 2016. And it has not worked. And it's very obvious that this will probably be a political win for Donald Trump if he doesn't take it too far. But I mean, he could absolutely take it too far because people do notice that there's a crime problem in DC. 91% of the residents in DC say that it is either a moderately to very serious problem, and 50% of them say it's extremely or very serious. So the people that live in DC, and this is a Washington Post poll, by the way, this is not a Fox News poll or something. Washington Post is saying 91% of the residents say it's a moderately serious problem. You should pay attention when people, in this case, the people of DC, which I realize Democrats don't worry about because they think they just have them in the bag in every blue city and every blue state, and they don't have to do anything for those votes. And I think that's starting to not work for Democrats. I think we saw in the last election that you can't pretend that the border, and Joe Biden tried this over and over again, right? The border's not a problem. Immigration's not a problem. Inflation's not a problem. They just try to pretend things aren't a problem and hope that whatever they say makes it go away. And it's not working for them. So it's not that I'm blaming Democrats for this, but the crime problem specifically is very much a Democrat problem because the 2020 stuff of embracing the defund the police, and I'm not saying we don't have criminal justice reform that needs to happen. I am very much Mr. Criminal Justice Reform in the sense that I think police unions are evil, frankly. I don't think that state employees should be able to unionize and then basically elect the people that are their bosses. I think there's a real problem there. There's all sorts of reforms I think that should happen within police departments, but most of it involves more training and more funding and more police. When you send police into areas, which by the way, in DC, most of those homicides are happening in two of the wards, Ward 7 and Ward 8. And Donald Trump is sending the National Guard to like the mall where you'd go to the Washington Monument. That is not where the crime is happening. That is the proof that this is about optics for Trump and not really about solving the problem, is that he's sending people to places that they don't need to be. Chuck Schumer sort of giving a little more fuel to the fire for Donald Trump. They ask if, would he extend the 30-day sort of trial of this? And he said, no effing way, except he actually said the expletive. Democrats are into cursing now, apparently. That's how they think they're going to get at edge, is they're going to curse in front of cameras. And then he goes, this is ridiculous. I feel totally safe. I walk around the Capitol all the time. I get up in the morning and I go, like, my man, Chuck Schumer, do you not understand that, first of all, you have a security detail that follows you, the Capitol Police? That's one thing. Step two, you're walking around what is probably one of the most secure buildings in the country, the United States Capitol. You've got a police presence all around there. The carjackings are not happening outside the Capitol. The muggings are not happening right outside the Capitol. Chuck Schumer has just an amazing amount of elite nonsense going on in his brain that he can't figure out that's not what 91% of the people that live in the very place he's talking about feel like. And he's trying to wave it away as if like this is not a problem. Having the fourth highest murder rate in the country is a problem, and Democrats can't pretend that's not a problem. But they'd like the problem to just go away. It's not going to. You have to change the way the police work. Really, the problem in DC is that the prosecutions, as I mentioned earlier, are not happening. So there's a few specific cases where the handguns, for example, let's find this thing. This is a graphic on the non-prosecution of gun charges specifically. So this is from an analysis of the 2023 crime stats. So this is not 2024. It's a couple years old. And to be fair, 2023 was, again, the peak of this. But in 2023, the prosecution filter for gun possession cases looked like this. The USAO outright declined to prosecute 33% of arrests for felony gun possession. So a whole third of the police picking people up that have guns illegally, a third of them, the prosecution just decided we're not going to charge them at all. So a third of people just walked away from that. 37% of the initially charged cases were later dropped without a conviction. So we are at a lot of them, right? 50% of the convictions the U.S. Attorney's Office did win were for misdemeanors only. That means that they pled down. So that instead of sending them to trial, they do a plea deal where your felony gun charge becomes some sort of misdemeanor. It's probably not on your like sort of permanent record as far as felonies go, even though you were caught maybe with a machine gun. And then there were literally cases of people modifying Glocks so that they were fully automatic, getting arrested with them, and then never serving a day in jail. We don't take violent crime seriously if that's how we're treating violent criminals, okay? So cumulatively, this filter means that only 21% of adults arrested with an illegal gun in D.C. end up with a felony conviction. So you've got a 1 in 5 chance of getting a felony conviction if you're walking around with a gun illegally in D.C. And we say we take gun violence seriously. We say we take crime seriously. And yet here are people, either being caught with guns illegally, which again, I don't necessarily think that, I don't like DC's laws as far as gun control goes. I am obviously much more for people having Second Amendment rights to carry and defend themselves. However, if that's the law, we should enforce it. And we're not doing that. And this gets to all sorts of other crimes too. Most of the carjackings are done by teenagers. And so the Democrats sort of have this soft on teenage. We don't want to fix this. We can't get off this treadmill of this generational problem. And really the problem in DC boils down to this. A lot of the crimes are committed and the victims are Black people. And we talk about Black Lives Mattering. The whole Black Lives Matter thing happened in 2020. We painted a whole street in DC with Black Lives Matter. And yet 96% of the shooting victims in DC are Black people. So do their lives matter or do they not? Now, they're also shot by Black people at the same rate. So because it's Black people shooting Black people, we don't care. We only care about it if they're shot by cops. Like, I think we should care about people being shot regardless of the color of their skin. Specifically in DC, this is an amazing stat to me. This is from The Atlantic. They had a stat that said 3.4 out of every 1,000 Black boys and men aged 15 to 24 in Washington died by homicide. That's nearly 3.5 times higher than the national rate for the same demographic. And they, go on to say, not all of DC may be like a war-torn country, but these rates of death are on par with those of American combatants in Afghanistan and Iraq. So you had basically the same chance of dying in Iraq and Afghanistan as you do if you are a 15 to 24-year-old black male in DC. That should not be okay with us, okay? And we know how to solve this problem. There is a analysis of the crime data. This was going back to 2021's numbers from DC. They said they basically know it's about 500 people are responsible for about 70% of the violent crime in DC. So all you got to do is arrest those people and prosecute those people and put them in jail and get them off the streets. I know that sounds really simple, and I know it's more complicated than that, but it's not really more complicated than that. We know the solutions to preventing crime from happening. It's more police, it's better trained police, and it's prosecutions that prosecute the laws that the legislatures have passed. I'll talk about guns for just a little bit longer, just because I think it's important to say. I hear all the time when we're dealing with gun violence, and people say, I just want common sense gun reform. We want common sense gun laws. Okay. I think a common sense gun law is that if you are a felon convicted of a crime, and then we say you can no longer own a gun after that. Now, I think that some of those things could change. I think if you are convicted for nonviolent felonies, I don't necessarily think we should take away your Second Amendment rights, but that's a totally different thing. However, if you are convicted of a violent felony, I'm okay with saying you don't get to own guns anymore. That is a part of your punishment, as we decided you are not trustworthy with a weapon of that kind of destruction. And we say that, and we have those laws on the books. I would say that we all agree that that's a common sense gun law, right? However, we know that every year, thousands and thousands of formerly violent criminals that have been convicted lie on gun registration forms and say that they have not been convicted of a felony. And then they try to buy a gun. And we know this happens, and a lot of them do end up getting the gun because the NICS system is totally messed up and is inefficient, and it doesn't work perfectly. And so some of these people get guns. The very signing of the form, lying on the federal form for the background check, that is a felony. We never enforce that law. It is like 1% of the people that we literally have their signature on a form with their address on it, where we could go to their house and say, you lied on this form, you are a convicted felon, and you are going back to jail because you tried to get a gun when we told you couldn't have a gun. We do not prosecute that crime in America. We also don't prosecute straw purchases. Straw purchases are where I might go buy a gun, but it's not really for me. It's for my buddy who I know cannot get a gun through the normal background check system. This is apparently how the gunman in or the one in Manhattan that just happened. It was like he worked at a casino or something, and it was like his boss bought the gun for him. And it was one of those things where if you buy a gun knowing you are going to transfer that to someone else that is not allowed to have that gun, that is a straw purchase. We never prosecute that either. And the reason we don't prosecute that is because for people in sort of the gangs of DC, it's their moms, it's their girlfriends, it's these other people that we feel bad about putting in jail. My point is that if we're taking crime seriously, you've got to take those kind of crimes seriously. And we have the laws on the books to stop this from happening, but we're not enforcing them. And that's partially that the U.S. Attorney's Office is not taking this seriously. And I've had some arguments with people about this kind of Trump stuff in DC, and they're like, in general, Republicans are, I'm for it. He's going to clean up the streets. And I go, okay, how is the National Guard being at the mall going to help clean up the streets of DC? When Donald Trump could have just said, hey, I'm instructing the U.S. Attorney's Office to take gun crimes and violent crimes seriously in this place. Now, the part that doesn't get talked about as much in all of this is the appearance of crime. Homelessness is a problem that Donald Trump clearly sees when he's in the Beast, driving from the White House to his golf course, for example. And it is a problem in DC. It's a problem in a lot of major cities. And it kind of goes back to the Democrats thing of let's just pretend this isn't a problem, and let's also make people feel bad for pointing it out as being a problem. And hence us having to no longer say homelessness. We've got to say whatever, people struggling with housing, or I don't know, whatever kind of stupid things. It doesn't matter what label you put on it. It doesn't make it any prettier if someone's taking a dump in front of your kids at the mall in DC. And that is a problem. Now, it's not a violent crime problem, but it is a problem that needs to be solved. Entire LA has got this problem. A lot of cities have this problem. And some people have figured out how to solve homelessness, not solve it, but make it better. And do it in a way that's not just saying, well, let's just push you somewhere else where I don't have to see the problem, like actually solving the problem. That is a huge part of DC's problem. And again, it's a big problem for Democrats. It is a problem for people and for voters, and they see it with their own eyes, and this is not just the guy outside with the tin cup saying, can you spare some change? This is I went to New York last year with my 10-year-old at the time daughter and my wife, and I'd heard all sorts of horror stories about New York. I've been to New York a ton. I love New York City. And when we got there, it was spring break, to be fair, so large police presence because they know there's a lot of tourists and stuff. The National Guard, like I said, down in the subways and stuff. There was only one time I was scared, and it was because this guy who looked homeless-ish, except he looked, clearly on some sort of crazy drugs, and he was looking for a fight. Like, he was screaming at strangers on the street, and he wanted the fight. And it was the only time that I actually looked around and kind of thought, okay, what's a weapon that I have? And it was the only time I saw my daughter actually scared, okay? That's a real thing that, like, she's going to remember that. I certainly remember that. And like I said, it happened one time. We were there for a week. It wasn't some crazy problem. You obviously see the people that are sleeping on park benches and putting up tents places. That's an eyesore for sure, but I live downtown in Oklahoma City, and we see it too. We've had people in the neighborhood where sometimes it's like, I'm going to help you get out of here. And then there's other times that people are scary enough that I just call the police because I'm not going to, if someone's outside my window screaming at themselves at the top of their lungs, I'm not sure that I can, I can't reason with that person. And the Democrats are the ones that would shame me for calling the police. Well, you should call someone else. They're not equipped to do that and stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, look, there's someone outside my house that seems dangerous, maybe just to themselves, maybe to others. I don't know, but I'm not rolling the dice on that. And this is a problem in a lot of major cities. And it's definitely a problem in DC. And the Democrats just want to pretend it's not a problem. So I've railed on the Democrat side enough. I do feel like I need to take a moment just to say that I think Trump is wrong in the sense that this is not going to solve the problem. I do think Trump has, clearly authoritarian tendencies. If Donald Trump could have all the control and whatever he says goes, that's what he wants. And this is a pattern now where he fakes an emergency and then uses that as an excuse to do something that we foolishly gave the President of the United States the power to do. Now, I don't think we actually have in a lot of those cases. I do think the Supreme Court is going to end up taking the question of, does Trump really have the emergency power to do tariffs? And I don't think that they'll side with Donald Trump on that, because I think it's so plainly obvious in the Constitution that the Congress has that power of tariffing and taxing, and that Donald Trump, as a single person at the top of the executive branch, cannot just pick executive orders based on emergencies that are around. So Donald Trump does this. He claims something is an emergency. So with trade for the tariffs, he claims that the emergency is that we have trade deficits with other countries. We export less to them than we import from them. That's been that way for decades and decades. So emergency means, emerge is in that word, if you've noticed, which means it's happening right now and it's ramping up. It's not. That's not an emergency, but he can claim it's an emergency because Congress was stupid enough to not just actually define what an emergency is, or have some sort of kickback where they have to say, well, within 30 days of you declaring an emergency, we get to decide if it continues to be an emergency, which in this case in DC, they did set it up that way. Congress does have to give the president permission to do this beyond 30 days. But guess where the GOP is going to land on that? Because Republicans are spineless and they will just cave into him. Of course, he's going to have to get some Democrats on board too, but he'll probably just circumvent that. So he did that with tariffs. He's done this with all sorts of other things. He's done this with, in this case, he's claiming the crime in DC is an emergency. Crime is bad in DC. It'd be hard to claim it's an emergency when it's 30% homicide rate down from last year. It's certainly down from its peak a few years ago. It's down from even when he was the president in his first term. So, how is that an emergency right now? So I don't trust Donald Trump's motives. I don't trust that he doesn't want the full authoritarian kind of thing. He campaigned on this. He's campaigned on sending the National Guard into blue cities. It's funny that he never mentions the red cities, by the way. It's funny that he never mentions red states. It's always only blue states, blue cities and blue states. That's where the crime is rampant. It's not in any of these other areas that might be controlled by Republicans. So I don't trust his motivation here. And I don't think what he's doing will work, in the sense that I think it's all for show. That's why you send the National Guard to be in front of the tourists that are visiting the mall. It's not for really changing what's happening. Because if you really wanted to change what's happening, you would get a higher police presence in Ward 7 and Ward 8. You would make sure the U.S. Attorney's Office diligently prosecuted people that committed violent crimes. And you would be appointing judges so that we don't have the court backlogs that we do, so that prosecutions don't feel like they have to take plea deals all the time. Huge problem in criminal justice right now, in my opinion, is that for the most part, and this has always been the case, but it's gone up and up and up and up every year. It's something like 97% of federal cases are plead out, which means they never go to trial. And in DC, it's a similarly very high rate. It's in the 90s as far as how many are just taking plea deals. And the easiest way to get a plea deal is, obviously, if someone's going to take a guilty plea, they're always going to lower the charges. So what the reason this is a problem in criminal justice, in my opinion, is that what you do is that you get an overcharging initially by DAs. They will find every law they can throw at you, every single one, including some that they're not really enforcing on other people necessarily. And it's really just a way to trump up the charges, to really get a bunch of charges, so that you go, oh, well, you could go to trial here, but there's a risk that you're going to go to jail for the next 40 years because of all these different things we're charging you with. I think we have too many laws that prosecutors can take advantage of. So then they plead them down. In the case of just catching someone with a gun in DC, it's basically the felony gun possession charge. That's the charge. So to plea it down, you have to change it from a felony to a misdemeanor. And I think that's a huge problem because, again, we say gun violence is a problem, but our actions are not following through on that. Because if gun violence is a problem, we shouldn't let people off with misdemeanors that either commit gun violence or are in possession of a gun where, why else would you have the gun? If it's illegal, it should be illegal. So I don't think we're going to solve the crime problem in DC. I don't think Trump's going to. I think that this is a lot of cheerleading. But here's the thing. He's going to get the credit for trying, while Democrats sit on the side and say, it's not a problem. There's nothing to see here. Going back to that playbook from that blog. It's a really fair point that Democrats keep doing this over and over again and hoping for different results. And they're not going to get it. And I think they're drowning as a party right now. But I don't love where the Republicans are either. I think everyone can be bad here. I think the problem, again, is that people have decided that they've picked a team or a religion now. And you can never say anything bad about your side of your team or your religion. You're a heretic if you do that. And that's how we're treating politics. And so Democrats have to pretend that there's no crime problem in DC, and they have to toe the line of they're not saying defund the police anymore, but they're saying, oh, well, yeah, the police are the problem. And over criminalization of stuff is the problem. And I'm not saying they're not right in some situations, but they go all in on one side of it and can never look at the other side of the coin and say, oh, maybe that there is a valid point there. Maybe the murder rate being the fourth highest in the country is a problem that we should try to tackle. And they just hope that it goes away. The problem with crime and rampant homelessness and these things that we can see with our eyes and are going to make the local news every time, by the way, the news is always going to run the bad stories, but you're going to hear about the shootings. You're going to hear about the gang violence. You're going to hear about the carjackings. You're going to hear about those things on the news. And people's perception is obviously that there's a problem. And then when you try to tell them you try to gaslight them into believing that that's not a problem, it's just not going to work. And so Republicans, Trump will get the credit for it. And I hear it all the time when I talk to people that are much more supportive of Trump than I am. And they say, well, at least he's doing something. And I hear that all the time. At least he's doing something. And so he's getting the credit for doing the things, even if they are authoritarian in nature, even if they are foolish and won't actually make the problem any better. He's going to get the credit for it. And I think that as we start heading towards the midterm, or the other thing that Chuck Schumer said, this is just a distraction from the Epstein stuff. Okay, I mean, you can say that all you want. I'm not saying there's not some truth to that, probably. It's clear that Donald Trump is trying to get people to focus on other things and not the things that are going bad for him, like that his economy is not growing and that jobs are not growing and the job reports are bad and home sales are down and everything. He's trying to distract people from all that bad stuff. It's not just the Epstein thing. And yeah, of course he's trying to do that. That's what every president does. I mean, Joe Biden did that all the time. Let's just distract you from the thing that's really bad and tell you that it's not bad. You're clearly, your lying eyes are fibbing to you. It just doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, I think both sides can be bad here. I think until people realize that both sides are lying to them and quit just picking sides blindly, this is not going to get any better, because Republicans are just embracing the Trump authoritarianism because he's doing something, and so are some independents and Democrats. Trump won, increased in demographics, votes in every demographic in 2024 from 2020, other than college-educated white women. That's the only one he didn't gain in. It works. People are okay with authoritarianism if it solves the problem that's in front of them that the other side claims doesn't exist. So anyway, that's a lot to say that I think that this is going to continue. And I think this is basically going to be a silly charade we do for 30 days, and crime in DC won't necessarily get any better. And, you know, Democrats could come to Trump right now and say, okay, we're going to call your bluff. What do you think the district needs to solve the problem? Is that more funding? Let's give them funding. If it's more police, let's give them more police. I don't think they should use it as a bargaining chip to try to, like, I don't know, change something about the big, beautiful bill. I think that would be a mistake. I think that would then give the appearance that you're trying to use crime as like a bargaining chip. But I mean, you know, Democrats could get on board and get some credit for this, but their base is so split between, you know, the sort of really progressive part of the base that's saying, oh no, we can't do that. Like, police are the problem. The criminals aren't the problem. You blame the victims again, you know, kind of thing. I don't think that's going to work a lot. Nick Cottagio at the Dispatch had a good quote about this. He said, the Democratic Party, in short, is caught between two groups of post-liberal idiots. One that doesn't care enough about tyranny, and another that doesn't care enough about disorder. Whatever its leaders end up doing will probably backfire. And I think that's right. I think there's too many people on the right and even in the middle now that are just like willing to embrace Trump's. They don't care about liberalism. They don't care about constitutionalism. They don't care about norms at all. And then there's a group of other people that just don't really care about the disorder. And that's where we are with most of the Democratic Party. They're saying you shouldn't care about shoplifting. You shouldn't care about carjackings. I don't think that's going to work out very well for them at all. Okay. Last thing before we go, I want to talk a little bit about the sort of increasing amount of China-like things that we're doing as a government, and why does it not bother people? So I've talked in recent episodes about the U.S. Steel acquisition by a Japanese company. This was something that Biden blocked for just no reason other than, I mean, he claimed it was for, again, national security, as if Japan's our enemy geopolitically. They're not. Blocked the sale of U.S. Steel, claimed it was going to be some sort of monopolistic thing that would not protect American. Really, this was so silly, because this is something that U.S. Steel wanted. It's something that the workers wanted. Japan is very good at manufacturing steel. That actually make us more efficient at it. It'd probably be an increase in jobs in the steel industry, but Biden blocked it. Trump allows it to go through, but with some caveats. And one of those caveats was that the U.S. government gets a golden share of the company. This is something that China does with every single company in China. China gets some control of the company, so they can and can't do certain things. They can get access to all their data and all that kind of stuff. That's what China does. The U.S. has now done it with U.S. Steel. Donald Trump, essentially, right now, because he's the president, has veto power out of all sorts of things that go on at U.S. Steel. And you're allowing the government to come into private industry and not regulate it, but actually control it. Like, the U.S. government has a little bit of ownership in U.S. Steel now. I don't think that's a good thing. I call that socialism, and I think everyone would call it so. Everyone on the right would call it socialism if a Democrat did it, but we don't, because Trump did it. Okay, so that was one example. Now we have, we had blocked, we claim that China is our geopolitical foe and that they're up to no good, which I think is all absolutely true. But, so we said, you can't ship, basically did export controls. You can't sell chips to China. So these are the advanced computing chips that are going to help us in sort of the AI race, right? China did not have access to those chips, and we started, we're trying to use these sort of bargaining chips. It's a terrible analogy because they're called chips. But anyway, the point is, Donald Trump is now saying, okay, here's the deal. We came up with a great deal. We're going to allow NVIDIA and whoever else to sell chips to China, but they've got to give us 15% of the sale. Okay, again, that's the state getting involved in private business and saying what they're allowed to do. And by the way, this is a one-off thing. This is not like a regulation where they said, okay, now across the board, anyone that does that gets, this is a couple of companies. It's picking winners and losers. It's the government getting involved in private industry. And you could say, okay, well, yeah, but Blake, there's a national security risk there because we're dealing with China. Okay, what is the long-term goal then? If we're trying to beat China geopolitically, idea-wise, communism versus capitalism, all these kind of things, why are we giving them the chips that would allow them to potentially beat us at the AI race? Because everyone most of the smartest people are claiming AI is really the next frontier of like, we really need to have that edge. We can't allow China to control the AI that goes out across the entire world. That would be bad for us and the rest of the world, we think. So why are we giving them the chips? Because Donald Trump gets a headline that says, I got a good deal and we're getting 15% of the sales. This is a great deal. It's going to amount to like $5 billion in taxes, essentially. It's not really that much in the grand scheme of things. So like, why is this okay with people that claim they're free market capitalist? People that claim they don't want cronyism. This is absolutely cronyism. And like beyond the strategic stuff, it doesn't make any sense to me strategically because you're giving China what they want. I know they're going to claim, well, we got mineral rights and stuff, or not mineral rights, but we get access to rare earth materials and things that China was trying to lock us out of that we need. And so we have to do this. Okay. But here's the real problem I have with it is that it's not constitutional. The Constitution clearly lays out that the federal government cannot create export taxes. We can tariff things as they come into the country, but specifically you cannot export tax things. So I don't understand how that's not an export tax. You're saying here's this one country that you are not allowed to sell to, but if you sell to them, we get 15% of that sale. It's a tax. It's a tax and it's illegal. It's unconstitutional. So will anyone actually go, hey, this is unconstitutional? And it's interesting to me that not no one. I mean, there are people that are talking about it, but no Republican in Congress is talking about it. None of them are claiming, first of all, this isn't even a power that Congress has, is to create export taxes. So if we can't have an export tax, and by the way, this is going all the way back to the founding of the country because they didn't want, again, this was to try to prevent the sort of cronyism that would happen and the corruption that happens when you say, okay, well, you guys can't export, but you guys can export. You can just shut down people's businesses. And Donald Trump's doing that, and we're okay with it. So why are we so okay on the right specifically with Donald Trump getting the state involved, like very much involved, not just like owning parts of companies that are private companies and hinging deals on them being able to control stuff? This is open corruption going on. I don't like it at all, and I really don't like that no one on the right is talking about it. Again, that's unfair. Not no one on the right, but the bulk of the people on the right, and certainly not the people that are elected, are talking about how this is a bad idea. And the reason I think it's worth bringing up is because, especially to people who are conservative or think of themselves as Republicans, is I want you to think about in 2029, when President AOC is in the White House, having all these same powers and deciding that, for example, oh, well, your company, Chick-fil-A, maybe, we don't like you because we think you're bigoted against gay people. And so therefore we're going to try to shut down your business. Or we like X, Y, and Z business. And so we're going to, we're going to make a deal with them where they get, certain privileges that other companies don't to sell to China. We would have huge problems with this. We did have huge problems with this when Joe Biden tried to do some of this kind of stuff. And I think that's my problem, is that we're so inconsistent and we have no consistency on, are we really willing to give, for example, these emergency powers? Like, what's to stop the next Democratic president? And just go ahead and picture, I say President AOC, not because I think she'll really be the president, but because that's sort of the boogeyman for people on the right. But imagine the kind of your worst case scenario in there. Do you want them to have these powers that you're okay with Donald Trump having? I don't even understand why you're okay with Donald Trump having them, honestly, because I don't think he's trustworthy to have these kind of powers that we've given the executive branch. But, imagine that we give the president of the United States that's a Democrat next time the ability to send the National Guard to a city that maybe they don't like because they're trying to protect, I don't know, a hospital's right to do transgender surgeries for minors. Okay, like that's a real thing. Or they could prosecute people based on their feelings on gay marriage or their feelings on gun control. You know, so for example, if there's a company that or a state or a city that doesn't have gun control laws that the president of the United States doesn't like, would you like them to be able to go in and enforce federal gun laws with the National Guard or something? I'm just like, think of the scenarios and think of, would you want a Democrat to have this power? And I think the answer most of the time is no, if you're being honest. And so I don't think that we should give any president these powers. And Congress has kind of foolishly done so for a long time. I think my only hope at this point, it's not in Republicans in Congress. They are feckless and they will never stand up to Donald Trump for any reason. The Supreme Court's kind of the last man standing that could say, actually, you don't have the power to do this. You do not have these emergency powers that you claim you have. You cannot implement tariffs. It would actually be a good thing for Donald Trump. I know this sounds wild, but if the Supreme Court could rein him in, I think the tariffs will be bad for him economically. And I don't really care what's good or bad for Donald Trump at this point, but I don't want the economy to tank. I don't, just in general, because I live here, you know. It's not worth me being like, I told you so. I would like tariffs to go away, but they're clearly, no one's going to stand up to Trump other than potentially the Supreme Court. So I hope the Supreme Court does rein in some of those executive powers. I know people are not hopeful on that because they feel like they've given the executive branch a lot of powers. I think they're pretty fairly so far. I'm not saying I don't disagree with the Supreme Court sometimes, but I think for the most part, they are getting it right as far as what the Constitution says. And I think very often they are saying, hey, look, very clearly within the constitutional rights, Congress has that right, not the President of the United States. And they're often saying that. They're often saying, hey, you know, Congress, actually what they're saying a lot of times is the president has maybe this executive right, but guess who can change that? Congress can change it if they want to. Congress actually has the ultimate power. They've just given some of this power away to the executive branch. So we can't say that the law is inaccurate. It's just that they could change the law. So I think the Supreme Court might do this in the future, but my point is just in everything that someone does, just think about if you lean right or if you support Trump more than you don't, then just think about if we give a Democrat the same powers that we're trying to excuse Donald Trump abusing, would we be okay with it? I don't think that if you're honest, you would. And I think Democrats should feel the same way. I think that they should think should not be hard for them to imagine what the executive branch with unlimited power is. But instead of them reining that in, Joe Biden could have done that when he was president. He could have said, you know what? I got elected to not be Donald Trump and to stop Donald Trump. And the only way to stop Donald Trump is to stop some of the power that the executive branch has and actually rein some of that back in. And so I'm going to give up some power. He would have gone down as a great president. He didn't do that, obviously, because he's as much of a egomaniac as Donald Trump is. And so he didn't. He tried to scoop up more of it. He tried to talk about packing the Supreme Court. He tried to forgive student loans. He abused the pardon power, in my opinion. So he abused his power as much or the same as Donald Trump. And so now we've got this tit for tat thing. Well, Democrats do it, so Republicans are going to do it. And then the only way to fight the redistricting in Texas, again, we talked about that last week. Democrats are now saying, well, you know what? We're going to go back on our independent commissions and we're going to jerry-rig our state in response to because Republicans did the bad thing. We've got to do the worst thing. It's never going to get better. And if we are not an electorate that demands that we be the country that we want to be, you know, we believe in the liberal order, we believe in law and order, we believe in free market capitalism, it's not apparent that voters believe in those things anymore. So I think we're in for a long haul here. So that does it for me. Thank you for spending some of your valuable time with me. I appreciate it. If you can do one thing for me, rate the podcast wherever you listen to it. That really helps me a lot. The other thing you can do is go follow me on YouTube. If you can do a second thing, because I'm doing shorter, like 5-minute videos and some shorts and stuff on there. I'm doing more content throughout the week if you want to see like short little blurbs on what is going on in the moment. But other than that, I will catch you next time. Thanks for joining me.